I'm just going to talk a little bit today about how I reuse other people's work in making poems, and whether or not that raises any copyright issues, I will leave for the experts in the room. I was a lawyer in a previous life, but I stayed well away from intellectual property. So I have a vague sense of when something might be going over a line in the sand, but I take the trouble to not look it up. So I'm just going to take you through a few examples of things, mostly from this book, the one that Nikki was kind enough to mention won the prize at the end of last year. And there's a number of different ways that I reuse other people's work in the book. And this is not a comprehensive list even of what's going on in the book, and it's certainly not a comprehensive list of the ways that contemporary poets mash up and reuse things. So it's kind of an anecdotal talk rather than a survey. And I'm going to take you through some of the things that you can see on screen there, things called cut-ups, a poetic form called a glossa, poems using hidden quotations. I also use the Internet Anagram Server to write poems sometimes, which is not reusing someone's content so much as someone's method that they've made available. Similarly with Google Sculptures, I'm using something that someone else has made, an algorithm, to make my poems. And finally, there's another poetic form called a cento, which is a poem made out of lines from other poems. And that's an established practice in poetry. You're meant to attribute the poems that you take your lines from, of course. And I've been playing around with centos, and I even made an impressively nerdy little generator that makes centos out of lines from this book. So we'll kind of walk through all of those. It's only going to be a few seconds on each one, though, so we're not going to be here for hours. So first, looking at cut-ups, Nikki mentioned there's a text installation using my words over at Old Parliament House at the moment. It's part of an exhibition called Bespoke, Design for the People, which was a joint thing between Craft ACT and the Museum of Australian Democracy. And the brief was to respond creatively to furniture that's in the Old Parliament House, and the part of it that I got to play with, along with my collaborator, the letterpress printer Karen Florence, who's sometimes known as Ampersand Duck. We got to play with a room full of old-fashioned wooden signs. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the original material was, and we decided it would be fun to do some cut-ups. So what we did was we took the text, or I took the text that was on the signs, and we reused it to make some new signs. And in this scenario, we were being given permission to do anything we wanted with the text on the signs. There was no need to go and separately seek permission from a copyright owner or anything like that. The resulting work, I suppose even though it sounds like the sort of thing I would want to hit somebody for saying, it is a text installation rather than a poem, because you have to be standing in the room to get it, as it were. So we took the words on the signs that said things like members phone, end of servery, and take care on polished floor, and a whole lot of other things about where members and visitors can and can't go and what representatives are doing in various parts of Parliament House. And I typed out all the words and cut them up and moved them around and tried to come up with interesting versions of things. And then Karen got her letterpress printer happening and printed gold and brown versions to kind of echo the content and the idiom of the existing signs. And we came up with a bunch of 8 of them, with slightly cheeky but demonstrably neutral language. It could be about any parliament or any government. So there are things that say, would indicated members please exit Parliament? And representatives are not about to be polished for the visitors. And if you want to see more of them, just pop over to Old Parliament House. It's free to go in and have a look. And here's a close-up of one, which was slightly more poetic. the only interesting word on any of the signs was the word polished, so it reappears a few times. Use the polished hour, care for the time between, point many to the end. And I also found out that hand signal is called a manicule. That's my new favourite word. Okay, so that's an example of a cut-up that's available for you to go and look at. Another thing that I've done, again, kind of switching back to the poems in this book, is a poetic form called a glossa. You take existing lines from someone's poem and you make them the end lines of the stanzas in your poem. So I took a quote from an Australian poet called Webb, and I exploded it into a poem on similar subject matter. It's dealing with kind of birth of a child and the aftermath. And I turned it into my poem Given. Now, this created interesting issues for me as a working creative who wanted to publish the results of what I'd done, because that poem, the Webb poem, which is called 5 Days Old, was still in copyright in Australia. So I had to try and find out who owned the copyright because he's deceased. I eventually traced it down to HarperCollins, at least the first time in 2008. And we came across an issue. The licence fee they wanted was $70. I was going to make $50 from the publication of the poem. And we come up against an issue that's quite common in... well, at least at this end of the creative enterprise, is that the sums of money involved for the work that you create out of someone else's work are so tiny that when you start asking for licence fees, it can kind of get a little bit ridiculous. I eventually just negotiated with HarperCollins that they would waive the fee the first time. The second time, I collected the poem with all my other ones and put it in this book, and I felt, you know, it was fair this time because I've got an ongoing income stream from the book that I should find them and pay them again. This time there was another organisation that also claimed copyright rights, which was the University of Western Australia Press. And I negotiated with them that I would just acknowledge them because they'd put together a bunch of Webb's poems in a selected collection. So I acknowledged them and I paid HarperCollins again. And that was kind of, you know, my experience with using in-copyright work, which is why I tend to use stuff that's in the public domain when I'm mashing things up mostly, or stuff that's created by people that I at least have an email address for that I can ask them personally, and generally because we're both impecunious poets, no money changes hands. So an example of something that I did using work in the public domain was a hidden quotation poem. It took a quote from the novel My Brilliant Career by Miles Franklin, and I hid one word of the quote in each of the lines of the poem, and the poem ended up being something totally other, nothing about summer really at all, but it was just a fun kind of creative game to play. And yet nobody wanted any money for that because everyone can get hold of My Brilliant Career off Project Gutenberg anytime they want. Another example of where I'm piggybacking off someone else's work is when I use the Internet Anagram server to make poems. Please go and have a play with this if you haven't. It's just the most fascinating thing. It's a free website. You can go and type in any string of text and get anagrams for it. And I was writing a poem about divorce, and so I typed in the words decree nisi and got anagrams. I got 354 anagrams, and then picked the best ones and arranged them in an order so that particularly when it's performed out loud, this poem kind of makes a weird alien kind of sense out of the process of divorce. And the end of the poem says, residence I, end ice, rise, which is kind of where the speaker in the poem comes to an accommodation with the new state of things. So obviously I've had some input into the poem as well, and I could have got there on my own, but it would have taken me weeks and weeks and weeks. And with the help of the Internet Anagram Server, I certainly was able to leverage the work that they'd done, and so I always acknowledge them when I perform this poem. Okay, and another example of a similar kind of process is Google sculptures, which they're not really a new thing. Poets in the US started doing them in the mid-90s, almost as soon as Google was available. But the idea is basically you use search engine results and make poems out of the lists that you get on your results pages. I wrote another book about autism, and one of the poems in it was a poem called I Am Autistic, which was looking at different concepts of claiming your disability. There's this big debate in, I suppose, in disability world about whether you say, I am a person with something or I am something. And there's a whole kind of identity politics subtext going on there. So that's the kind of thing that this poem was trying to play with. But I did it by just typing I am autistic into Google, and I didn't use the results in the order they came up. I got, I don't know, maybe the first 5 or 6 pages of results, and then winnowed them down and tried to come up with an order that made sense poetically. And the last line of this poem was my favourite. I am autistic, what's your excuse? So, and finally, just to finish up with, here's a little look at my acrostic cento generator. What's an acrostic cento generator? So I mentioned before a cento is a poem made out of lines from other poems. And the cento generator just is a simple software application that quickly assembles them. You give it the lines and it organises them into a poem for you. And the way that it does that is it uses an acrostic. So it takes a word. An acrostic is one of those really old-fashioned poems where you spell out a word down the side of a poem. So the initial letters of all the lines, when you read them vertically, spell out a word or a message. So to illustrate that in a more easily understandable fashion, if I were to enter the word fun as the acrostic word, then the cento generator that I play around with generates something that starts, a line that starts with F, a line that starts with U, and a line that starts with N. So you get fun spelt out down the side there. And the lines are all lines, you know, for copyright reasons. I thought, oh, well, I give myself permission to mash up my own work. So I put all the not all the lines, I selected some lines that lent themselves to reproduction in all sorts of different parts of speech from this book, and then put them as the kind of raw material for the generator to use. So you need, you know, at least 26 lines, one starting with each letter of the alphabet. And, you know, the creative input is really in selection of the lines. I built it using a demonstration-only license with a product called Oracle Policy Automation. In another life, I worked for a company called Softlaw, which was the originator of this technology, and eventually Oracle bought it. And it allows people who can't actually code to write programs in English using if, then, and, or, and not. So I did that part. So here's another example of the sort of thing I can spit out if I have an acrostic word using my own name. I did want to bring it along so we could play with it, but firstly, we haven't really got that long each, and secondly, it would cause security issues if I were to try and plug it into the library's system, so we're just making do with screenshots. And things get really complicated from a copyright stakeholder perspective when you do a performance with the cento generator. So you get the acrostic word from a member of the audience, and then the performer, who may or may not be the poet, types in each word, and then they perform each generated cento poem, and then you print out the cento and you get the poet to sign it and you give it to the audience member as a kind of takeaway freebie, the audience member who supplied the word. And so you've got a number of different possible stakeholders, most of whom wouldn't think of themselves as having any kind of copyright interest in anything. You've got the poet who wrote the original lines, you've got the developers at Oracle who wrote the code for Oracle Policy Automation, you've got the nerd who used Oracle Policy Automation to make the generator, you have the audience member supplying the acrostic word, and you have the performer who's performing the cento. And yeah, that's a minefield that fortunately, kind of intellectually, it makes for interesting contemplation, but no one really cares because the amount of money involved is so infinitesimal as to be amusing. So that's kind of really going to wrap up my tour of creative reuse. It's been going on for a very long time in poetry, you know, evidenced by the fact that there are actually poetic forms that are dedicated to reuse. And obviously now we have access to things like Google and the Internet Anagram Server and various other things. Mashup techniques are going to continue to evolve. Again, a lot of poets don't really care too much about the actual black letter law on this point, but it's accepted as good professional practice that you should consult the original author of stuff that you're reusing if it's not yet in the public domain. And sometimes no money changes hands. For example, Matt Hetherington, a Queensland poet, also did a cento without a generator of some lines in my book. And I, in return, did a cento of some lines in his book, which is called Eye to Eye. And we just agreed that, you know, whenever we perform the work, we'll acknowledge, if we ever publish it, we'll acknowledge each other as well. And the mutual advertising value to, you know, the 200 people in the whole of Australia who are interested in such things will be, you know, the end of the matter, so to speak. However, you still can get interesting poet catfights developing when the original author or copyright owner is not consulted or even acknowledged. And there's a link in the presentation there to a summary of a plagiarism controversy that arose last year involving poets Graham Nunn and Andrew Slattery and a whole lot of unacknowledged borrowed lines. And I'm remaining neutral because Australian poetry is a very, very small place. But you may find that interesting if you like to watch drama unfold between people fighting over really low stakes things. Okay, so I'm going to finish up and hand back over to Nikki. It's not quite wine time though, you do need to wait until everyone else has finished talking.